Peace. All right, so I think we reached our limit with the last clip, so I just need a few more minutes to just put a final pin in all of this. The last point we were making is to say that as you can see clearly in crap, I need to open my book here. As you can see clearly in the Nozick section, so around 378, 379. I was talking about page 379, right? So the idea I was saying was that slavery is not mentioned anywhere over here, right? Because of this reliance on the idea that, all politically free people, right, already had a certain freedom in a state of nature. And while there may be inequities at the level of, our individual abilities, our particular wills, right, when it comes to owning property and going out and being a go-getter and these kind of bootstrap arguments, the idea is that that inequality is not an injustice, right? So long as everyone had this natural freedom at the level of going out to pursue and accrue property in the first place. So that's why you see on page 380 this idea that Nozick is relying on the idea of saying that property does not fall from the sky like manna, right? Like the biblical reference of good things just falling from the sky, but rather property is worked for and accrued, and so it's a violation of these people's civil liberal rights, which are dependent upon their natural rights. It's a violation of their civil rights, right, to demand that they pay, right, the government, right, to produce government ends, even if those government ends can be articulated at the level of general wills. The idea is that these folks, if they wish to, they can do that, but the government cannot demand at the level of taxes and etc. Right. So that's what you see there on page 380. Right. Is that only a kind of free, maximally free capitalism can kind of produce the kind of societies, right? A maximally free, meaning like a minimal state capitalist society, is the only way of producing the political state that enforces our natural human freedoms, right? And all of this would be juxtaposed then with the kinds of understandings of a general will that would be required to produce this social state over here, right? So let me read the first. So on page 381, I think it gets summed up well, right? The first sentence of Nozick's book says, quote, individuals have rights and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights, right? Um, the idea, again, just to sort of sum up the Nozick section there, the idea there for Nozick, right, is that there is no way of talking about property that's not based upon our natural rights, but we'd have to begin with the world as already carved up for Nozick, right? We can't give a theory or an account of an actual move from the state of nature, right? But we can talk about the ways that property is already allocated in our world today. But we can nonetheless think about the state of nature and our natural freedoms, and then you can see the obvious conclusion there, which is to say that the government has no right then to tell people who've already accrued their property, all right? People already own the resources that they owned, right? The government then has no right to then tell them what they're supposed to be doing with their property, right? And so it's just at the bottom of 382, um, you can see where the text says, for example, Nozick claims that only a historical theory of acquisition can be truly just, and also claims that current entitlement to holdings is just only if original acquisition was just, right? And so the question becomes, was original acquisition just, right? And so then the argument then goes, well, we just literally cannot, right? The argument from Nozick and the minimalist state people would be that we just simply cannot go back and figure out if there were the kinds of inequities that Rousseau would have talked about, right? We just wouldn't know how to even track, the capital or whatever, right? The way to actually marking and weighing these inequities. These alleged historical crimes, these sorts of things. The reason I mention that, right, and I'm about to sort of end it, but the reason I mention that is to say, if we read the Marxist critique, and if we read the Africana critique that you'll be introduced to in about 2 weeks, you'll see a very direct, like they won't mention Nozick, right? But you'll see a direct rebuttal to those types of positions where the argument is no, we can totally go back and count the dollars, right? And folks have already done that work. It's obvious that Nozick wouldn't be interested in reading those kinds of people. But folks have done that work, and you'll even read about some of that work in chapter 1 of Charles Mills's book that we'll read at the end of the semester called The Racial Contract, where people aren't just pulling terms like reparations out of thin air. There is an idea and a discourse of a whole sort of genre of research around kind of tracking the historicity behind these moves, right? But you can see that there's just a sort of presumption of everyone's equal and natural freedom, where we might ask then, what about slavery, right? And what was the role of that? Or what about sexism, right? If we're going to talk about the inequities in terms of capital positioning between men and women, how did those things affect this sort of sense of property and natural right as the libertarians would sort of articulate them today? Let me say this about Rawls, right? You'll notice that Rawls and the liberals and the left, the Democrats, right? You'll notice that we're speaking about libertarians and we're kind of juxtaposing them. So it sounds like we're putting the right as libertarians and we're putting them against the left as the Marxists and the socialists. And you might be wondering, well, then what's the role of a Democrat who's said to be a left person, right? Well, you can see that they're still sort of located in this general framework. But what we'll notice with Rawls is Rawls saying that it may be possible, right, for us to sort of there's inequity, right? But inequity does not equal injustice, right? According to and we mean like capital inequity, right? There's inequity, but it does not equal injustice on the libertarian picture, right? For the democratic picture, there's is an idea that there must be a kind of equity if there's going to be justice, right? So the emphasis for Rawls then is not on visiting questions of slavery. Although he talks about sexism, you'll notice in the reading he stays very clear. Like he's very precise in the way that he alludes to race in certain rhetorical ways, but he doesn't actually mention it. Right? His argument is much more sound when thinking about white women. His argument gets much less sound when you start trying to think about how, say, black women would work in this. But the way that Rawls argues, though, is that there must be a way for us to establish a certain level of equity, even within a world where there might be certain inequities. There might be a certain kind of justice that we can have, right? Even within this world where there's inequity. But it's going to mean that we're going to have to kind of simulate, right, as it were. We're going to have to, that says equity, right? Equity or equality. We're going to have to kind of simulate, right, through what he calls a veil of ignorance. Ignorance. We're going to have to simulate through a veil of ignorance the kind of equity that would be required to produce just laws, right? So if this is all, a little confusing, this veil of ignorance should make more sense but in our next lecture. And it should really make sense as we juxtapose it with this idea of a general will in a socialist sense. It's in that way that you'll see that the left, or at least, the democratic position within our traditional view, does share certain languages with what's going on over here. But I think we'll see by sort of reading Rawls side by side with Marx that they're diametrically opposed to each other. And in certain ways, as I'll sort of conclude and pick up the argumentation next lecture, in certain ways, liberals are trying to produce a notion of equity within this sort of acknowledged unequal space as a way of retaining and producing justice in our traditional world. Whereas the libertarians would say this inequity does not equal an injustice in our world. Our world is sort of already just, right? So you might have the liberals saying we can produce justice without violating your natural rights. You might have the libertarian saying the world is already just, right? And then you might imagine the socialists saying that the leftists aren't going far enough. All right, we'll stop there. We'll talk about Marx and Rawls next time. Peace.